rot. She lies in her bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, oh, what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton is tired of...
These forbidding walls once stood witness to the hanging of a wife and mother. Her crime was the arsenic poisoning of a child. As she took her last steps to the scaffold, only Mary Ann Cotton knew the true story. It was a story full of horror. In 1873, her crime shocked the nation. But today, Mary Ann Cotton is Britain's forgotten serial killer. Ambitious, attractive and highly sexed, a trail of death followed her around the country. But how guilty was she? Was she just a misunderstood mother, unlucky enough to lose the people she loved? Was she a domestic angel, or an angel of death?
It seems likely that Mary Ann was a homicidal maniac.
A whole range of people who she purported to care for ended up dead when it became expedient.
The truth lies in unmarked graves in Cornwall, County Durham and Northumberland.
No darkness marked Mary Ann's early days. She grew up in a respectable working-class family with aspirations. They were poor, but not as badly off as many in the mining communities around Merton in County Durham.
Unusually, she was educated for a girl coming from a mining village at that time. Bearing in mind, it was just been a couple of years before that young children were still working down the mine. She wasn't. She was one of two children, living in a good environment, and she was educated.
She was even a Sunday school teacher and a devout Methodist. Later she was to recall those years as the happiest of her life.
When she was 16, she didn't go to places, I would call it then. She didn't become a servant in somebody else's house. She actually went to the mine owner's house in South Hetton, where she worked as a nursery assistant, but she was looking after the children. Again, she wasn't a servant in the house.
By all accounts, Mary Ann didn't like looking after children, but she liked the comfortable life she saw. At night she imagined what it would be like to have that life for herself, with a wealthy husband.
The chances are that Mary Ann wanted something better in life than to be a mere drudge, which was her fate if she was going to become a miner's wife like the rest of the girls in the village.
But it seems that Mary Ann had an eye for the men, and they rather liked her too. At 19, she was heavily pregnant by a local miner. They married in disgrace at Newcastle's old register office, where she gave a false age and address. It was a bad start to a bad few years. Her husband, William Mowbray, took her to a rough railway workers' town in Cornwall. Illness and death were part of everyday life. She had 5 babies, but 4 of them died. There are no death certificates, and no one will ever know what happened. They returned to the northeast, but life didn't get much better. William Mowbray took a job at sea, leaving his wife alone in the Docklands. In those days, it was the worst part of any town, filled with slums and frequented by criminals and prostitutes. By now there were several more children, and she was left in Sunderland to bring them up on her own. It was now that she met a young miner called Joseph Nattrass, who would figure in her life for years to come.
It's thought that she probably started an affair with Nattrass at that time, but of course Mowbray was there. She had three children, and Nattrass was engaged.
Perhaps Mary Ann began clearing the way. Soon one daughter passed away, then her baby son died a slow, agonizing death from gastric fever. And then on a trip home, her husband became ill.
Although you have to accept death was a regular feature of life, it wasn't at the rate that Mary Ann seemed to have people dispatched around her. Now Mowbray hurt his foot and he was sitting at home, and within a fortnight he was dead. Unexpected. Absolutely unexpected.
Another daughter died, leaving just one little girl. The death toll stood at 8, but this wasn't so unusual.
With the gravestone here of the Dixon family. Thomas dies at 14 days, then we've got 2 Susannas, 1 month and 2 years. We've got 2 Elizabeths, another 14 days and another month. And you can find these kind of gravestones all over the north of England.
This is the graveyard of Holy Trinity at South Hetton in Easington district. Mary Ann's first husband, William Mowbray, and 3 of the children of that marriage are buried here in unmarked graves. I think she did kill those people, but the evidence from the death certificates indicates otherwise.
The symptoms were the same as arsenic poisoning, but no one suspected anything. Mary Ann gave her one remaining child to her mother to look after. Mary Ann was finally free from children, but a lover, Nattrass, moved away, and she was now more alone than ever. If she'd harboured any dreams of romance, they were now at an end. Her next partner would be selected with care. Mary Ann collected her husband's insurance money and moved on. She next surfaced as a fever nurse in Sunderland Infirmary, where arsenic was used in medicines, but it was easy to get hold of elsewhere too.
The Victorian atmosphere was impregnated with arsenic. There was an Arsenic Act in 1851 which attempted to limit the sales of arsenic. If you went into the druggist to buy arsenic from 1851, you had to sign a register, but all you needed to say was you were troubled with rats, you were troubled with bugs, and you bought your arsenic. There was arsenic in medicine, there was arsenic in cosmetics, there was arsenic in the wallpaper. Some Victorian gentlemen, in fact, even dosed themselves with arsenic under the impression that it was an aphrodisiac.
At the hospital, she met a patient called George Ward. When he was discharged, they got married, but Ward never fully recovered. They lived on handouts, and Mary Ann was no closer to the good life. Then Ward suddenly got much worse, to his doctor's surprise.
But interestingly, he left Mary Ann with 12 leeches and said, "We think we should bleed him. You know what to do. Bleed him, but if the bleeding becomes excessive, or in actual fact if he becomes more ill, you call me out. I'll do that." But through the night, in actual fact, the leeches were left on. He bled profusely. He instructed Mary Ann to call the doctor. She is telling her husband, "I have," and he hasn't come.
A claim which the doctor denied, but suspicions were growing, so Mary Ann tried to blacken his name, though he was later cleared.
This is the first time when you see actual nefarious activity on Mary Ann's behalf, where she's telling lies, where a man is about to bleed to death, and she appears to be sitting watching him, and then lying to cover her tracks.
If Mary Ann was trying to get rid of Ward, she had to be more careful. Months later, he did die, half paralysed and in convulsions. Mary Ann had nursed him on weak tea and broth from a special teapot.
He was ill to begin with, and it's possible Mary Ann may not have had anything to do with his murder. But it's certainly curious that within a year the man had died in agony from some ailment which at least 2 doctors couldn't explain.
Beneath my feet lies the body of Mary Ann's second husband, George Ward. Did he really die of arsenic poisoning? Only an exhumation could tell us for sure, and after all these years, it's unlikely we'll ever find out. Once again, Mary Ann collected her husband's insurance money and moved on. She took a job as a housekeeper to a wealthy shipwright, recently widowed and with 5 children. She quickly seduced James Robinson, but his young family started dying. Mary Ann had fiancé number 3 in her sights, But suddenly she was called away from James Robinson to nurse her mother, who was slowly dying of liver disease.
Mary Ann went through to look after her mother, as would be expected of her, but told the neighbours that, oh, she'll not last long. The neighbours said, are you sure? She looks all right to us. So there was some suspicion there fairly quickly, but nevertheless the mother was dead in 9 days of convulsions, of diarrhoea. Mary Ann came back to Sunderland. Now, it's thought at the time that she saw her mother as a barrier to this good life with Robinson.
Now Mary Ann had to take back her only surviving child, Isabella Jane, who'd been looked after by Mary Ann's mother. What else could she do? Well, there was one solution, and soon the little girl joined 3 of Robinson's own children in the graveyard. Robinson, still besotted, married Mary Ann, but if he thought he was making an honest woman of her, he had a shock coming.
Mary Ann was disposing of his wealth without his knowledge. One moment he thought he was prosperous. He thought he had nearly £1,500 in the bank, a very sizable sum then. But in fact, he was nearly £600 down by the time Mary Ann moved out. She'd also been taking his clothes to the pawnbrokers, and she'd got him into debt with money sharks. The poor man was oblivious of all of this. He had not the faintest idea until the day of reckoning came, and he found out just who it was he'd married and what kind of person she was. The chances are he was next on the list. Mary Ann was trying to insure him and the kids, the surviving kids, the ones she had not yet disposed of. It's said from the Home Office file that he actually was tipped off by a neighbour and went round to the insurance company, the Prudential office in Sunderland, where he found Mary Ann sitting at a desk filling in a form to insure him and the kids. Very lucky.
The death toll stood at 15. Neighbours had started to whisper. It was time for Mary Ann to leave husband number 3 and move on again. She found shelter in Warbottle in Northumberland with an old friend, Margaret Cotton. But Margaret's kindness was to be her undoing, for she had a recently widowed brother, and her own life was insured in his favour. Once again, Mary Ann quickly bedded Frederick Cotton. He was poor, but it was any port in a storm. A port with no room for her best friend.
Well, Margaret Cotton was providing the services for her brother, of housekeeping, of looking after the children, that natural fact Mary Ann needed to have if she wanted to have a place in that home. So therefore Margaret was a barrier and she needed to go.
Soon Margaret was dead, Mary Ann was pregnant, and Frederick Cotton was making a trip to the register office. Mary Ann had been here before, standing pregnant in front of the registrar, but that was half a lifetime ago. This time there was a twist. She was still married to the Sunderland shipwright she defrauded, and was now pulling the wool over another man's eyes. You could get 10 years for bigamy, but that risk probably meant nothing to her by now. Soon the happy couple were on the move to West Auckland in County Durham, taking Mary Ann's new baby and Frederick's 2 sons from his previous marriage. But Frederick's days turned out to be numbered.
Within a year of their marrying, he had died of convulsions. Again, he'd been quite fit. It was unexpected.
But this time there was already another man waiting to take Frederick Cotton's place. It was a face from the past. Her old lover Joseph Nattrass, now widowed and conveniently living nearby.
Perhaps she met up with him coincidentally in West Auckland when she moved here from Warbottle in Northumberland. Perhaps this was by arrangement. She was almost certainly fed up of living with Frederick Cotton, her bigamous husband, for one reason or another. Perhaps he wasn't bringing in enough money. Perhaps he wasn't good enough in bed. Perhaps he was boring. Who knows?
Now, Nattrass also had lodgings in the same street. He moved into the house at a 3-month period, and it would appear that Mary Ann then had her heart's desire.
But Mary Ann's heart had hardened since those early days. She wanted money, not love, and she'd spotted it.
a better candidate turned up in the shape of the excise man, Quick Manning. He was middle class. He had a house in the same street where Mary Ann was living at the time. He had plenty of money, and most importantly, didn't have any bloody kids. Nattrass was a miner. He'd have earned perhaps 10 shillings a week.
Mary Ann was soon secretly pregnant to the excise man. Her lover and her 3 fatherless children were an inconvenience. The baby and one of the boys sickened and died. Then her lover, Joseph Nattrass, fell ill.
Nattrass clearly trusted Mary Ann, because when visitors came from the mines to see him, his workmates, he said, "No, Mary Ann's looking after me very well." So he totally trusted her, and whichever way Mary Ann chose to nurse him, he was happy to go along with that.
That misplaced trust led to his demise. The death toll now stood at 20. Mary Ann now had just one obstacle in the way of her best ever marriage. Her 7-year-old stepson Charles Edward was living on borrowed time. But Mary Ann was getting careless. She was about to make a fatal mistake.
She clearly didn't want Charles Edward. She went to see Riley, who was the welfare relieving officer, to say, "Can you put him into the workhouse?" And Riley had said, "Well, yeah, he can go in, but you will have to go in with him." And her response at the time was, "But I wouldn't go into a place like that." So it was clearly all right for the little boy, but it wasn't all right for her. She said, "I'm not his mother. Why should I be burdened with him? He's stopping me from earning many a pound." She said, "In any case, he probably won't get up," meaning he probably won't grow up. He'll probably go the way the rest of the Cuttons have gone. At which Riley said, "Well, but he looks healthy." And yet, within 6 days, he was dead.
The welfare officer was suspicious. He persuaded the local doctor to withhold the death certificate. There was a post-mortem and an inquest held in the house next door to Mary Ann's.
The very site where I'm sitting, the post-mortem took place of Charles Edward Cotton. I'm probably sitting on the actual site where the little boy was cut open. It was carried out by a local doctor, Dr. Kilburn. Unfortunately, he was quite unable to ascertain that the boy had died from unnatural causes.
The certificate was issued and the child was buried. If Mary Ann had murdered him, it looked like she'd got away with it. But the welfare officer wouldn't give up.
It was because of Riley's persistence that Dr. Kilburn decided to have another look at the mortal remains of Charles Edward Cotton, some of which he'd retained in a glass bottle.
To his horror, the doctor discovered arsenic in the stomach fluid. It could have been traces of medicine, but it was enough to order Charles Edward's body to be dug up. What he then found was worse.
He found 2 grains of arsenic inside the little boy, some of it quite undissolved, but he also found it in virtually every organ inside the child: his heart, his lungs, his kidneys, his stomach, his colon, far more than would be reasonably expected to be there, or in fact expected to be there. This resulted in the exhumation of Nattrass, the other 2 little boys.
One would imagine half of the population of the village would be standing under the walls around here watching the proceedings as they dug them up one after the other.
And of course you had post-mortem examinations then carried out on Nattrass, which it was found that there was actually 17 3/4 grains of arsenic in his body. I mean, that's a massive dose. Medical evidence at the time suggested that 3 grains would have killed him.
Mary Ann was arrested and taken to Durham jail to await trial. She was treated well by her warders, but this was her darkest hour, and she rediscovered her religion. In letters to old friends, later reprinted in local papers, she returned to memories of her childhood. The time you speak of my dark eyes, I was happy then, and them was days of joy to all of our souls. And the letter goes on, to tell you all the past I cannot, as it is too heart-rending to think on. And towards the end she says, But I shall try to put my trust in God, as you know I once did, and there was none on earth happier than I was then. She was tried on one charge, that of killing her stepson Charles Edward Cotton. Evidence from the exhumed bodies was brought in, but in fact the evidence was circumstantial. There was nothing to say she had actually given anyone any poison herself.
Poisoners very rarely have witnesses. They are often on their own with the person they poison. They're the only ones with access to them, and the witnesses, in actual fact, they're in the power, if you like, of the poisoner.
But Mary Ann had a bad defence lawyer who told her to say nothing. She stayed silent, and there were few to speak up for her. Meanwhile, the police had discovered just how many people close to her had died. It was all enough to convince the jury of a guilty verdict. A date was set for her execution. The press went to town on the story. Newspapers of the time called her a monster in human shape and said she killed for gain with fiendish relish. But how does history judge her?
I think Mary Ann would just dispose of a member of her family as she might dispose of any other household commodity, because that's what was required at the time. I think she developed into being a serial killer for convenience, for her own convenience, as opposed to enjoying killing.
There's so much contradictory evidence about Mary Ann. It seems likely from what has been discovered at West Auckland that she was a psychopath. But when she became a psychopath is difficult to say.
21 graves in Cornwall, Northumberland and County Durham hold their secrets to this day. No one will ever be sure how many of them became the victims of Mary Ann Cotton.
I think there's certainly suspicions around 15 of those deaths, or suspicious activities which are recorded in some way.
I think she was certainly guilty of 4 murders in West Auckland. She may well have been guilty of many of the 17 other deaths attributed to her. In 1873, 1 murder was enough to earn a dawn appointment with the hangman.
Mary Ann's last child, Edith, was born behind bars. She clung to the baby, who was pulled from her arms for adoption. The little girl had been the one living thing standing between her and the gallows.
Mary Ann, it's time.